In December 1993, Pablo Escobar had spent years appearing on Forbes magazine's list of the richest men on the planet, controlled most of the world's trade in the white substance, and had brought an entire state to its knees. He never let 3 presidents govern in peace. He transformed the language, the economy, and the fear of a whole country. And for a decade, his was the name no Colombian official dared say out loud without lowering his voice. On December 2nd of that same year, that man was running barefoot across a clay tile roof, dressed in jeans and a blue shirt, 2 pistols in his hands, and no army behind him. The most wanted operator on the continent ended up alone, surrounded by his enemies in a middle-class neighborhood of his own city. To understand how the man who had everything ended up cornered on that roof, and above all who handed him over, we have to go back to the final hours of his life, and to the months that made them possible. At his peak, Escobar was not a fugitive. He was a parallel power. He was born on December 1st, 1949 in Rio Negro, into a modest family from Antioquia, and from an early age he showed a cold talent for business and an even colder tolerance for violence. He started out stealing cars and working as a gun for hire, and by the late 1970s he had moved into the production and export of illegal merchandise. Within a few years, the Medellín Cartel he helped found alongside partners like Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, Carlos Lader, and the Ochoa clan came to control close to 80% of the world's production of that substance. With that fortune, he bought judges, politicians, police officers, and silence. His doctrine fit into 3 words: silver or lead. Anyone who refused the bribe received the threat, and anyone who refused the threat rarely lived much longer. Escobar even managed to be elected as an alternate member of Congress, chasing the immunity that a public office grants, until his past caught up with him and he was thrown out of politics. That rejection transformed him. From that moment on, he no longer wanted to buy the state. He wanted to break it. The war, he declared, was total. To stop extradition to the United States, which was his only real fear, the cartel under his command organized an unprecedented campaign of terror. He was held responsible for the deaths of hundreds of police officers between 1989 and 1993, for dozens of car bombs in the country's main cities, for the attack on a commercial airliner in mid-flight, and for the fall of key figures within the country's institutions, among them the liberal leader Luis Carlos Galán, the presidential candidate who had promised to take him on. For years, no prison, no judge, and no government could touch him. When he finally agreed to turn himself in 1991, he did it entirely on his own terms. A prison built to his specifications in Envigado, La Catedral, with a view, comforts, and guards that he personally approved in exchange for not being extradited. It was not a cell. It was a headquarters with decorative bars. That was the man they were hunting. But the man on the roof was no longer that man. By December 1993, almost everything that had made him untouchable had vanished piece by piece. The scale of that power is hard to imagine. At its height, Escobar's organization moved sums so enormous that much of the money could not even be counted. It was weighed instead, and a fraction of it was lost every year, eaten by rodents or ruined by damp in the hiding places where they buried it. He bought an enormous estate, Hacienda Nápoles, complete with a private zoo, a landing strip, and animals brought in from other continents. But at the same time, and this explains much of what came later, he built an image of himself as a benefactor among the poorest people of Medellin. He financed floodlit football pitches, handed over homes to families who had been living off the city dump, and gave out money in the marginal neighborhoods. To the state and to his victims, he was a terrorist. To thousands of residents of the hillside communities, he was a patron who had given them what no government ever had. That double identity was not a sentimental detail. It was a survival tool. For years, the loyalty of those neighborhoods was his best hiding place. The network that concealed him, warned him, and opened doors for him. A man protected by an entire community is almost impossible to find. That is why catching him took more than simply chasing him. He had to be isolated, the hands that held him up cut away one by one until not even that popular devotion could save him. And that is exactly what they did. The fall did not begin on December 2nd. It began in the early hours of July 22nd, 1992, when Escobar walked out of La Catedral. Rumors had been circulating that the government, embarrassed by reports of the luxurious life he was leading inside the prison, was planning to move him to a military facility. Before that could happen, the kingpin and several of his lieutenants simply walked out, taking advantage of the confusion of a badly executed operation. From that night on, he was a fugitive again, but this time without the machinery that had always protected him. The government immediately reactivated the search bloc, an elite unit made up of thousands of soldiers and police officers with a single purpose: to find him, alive or taken out. Behind them came the DEA, the CIA, Delta Force, and American tracking technology. Pablo Escobar was not brought down by a stray bullet or a stroke of luck. He was handed over piece by piece by the very people who had spent years living in his shadow. And the first pieces to break were his own partners. The trigger was inside that luxury prison. Before escaping, Escobar had ordered two of his own associates, Fernando Galeano and Gerardo Moncada, to be eliminated inside La Catedral over a dispute about money. It was a mistake whose consequences he badly miscalculated. The men who had worked for the two dead associates, terrified and furious, went looking for shelter and revenge where their former boss had the most enemies: the Cali Cartel, run by the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers, and the Castaño brothers, longtime rivals of the kingpin. Out of that alliance, on January 30th, 1993, a group was born that would change the rules of the war. They called themselves Los Pepes, an acronym for people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, and they were made up of former partners, former lieutenants, and old enemies, financed largely by Cali and quietly backed by sectors of the security forces themselves. They were not hunting the state, and they did not respect the law. They used exactly the same intimidation techniques Escobar had perfected but turned against him. For the first time, someone was playing by his rules and beating him at them. The Los Pepes offensive was surgical and personal. They began taking out the kingpin's lawyers, accountants, front men, and bodyguards, anyone who moved a single peso of his fortune or knew where he was. They destroyed his properties, burned his car collection, and blew up two of his mother Hermilda Gaviria's estates. His brother Roberto, who was in prison, was sent a letter bomb that cost him the sight in one eye. They eliminated his lawyer Guido Parra along with his underage son. Every action came signed with a note left on the bodies, so that Escobar would know exactly who was collecting the debt and why. Within a few months, the man who had spread terror across an entire country began living on the other side of fear. Under normal circumstances, someone with his fortune and his network would have had 1,000 ways out. But by that point, almost all of them were closed, and the ones still open were traps set by the people who knew him best. The erosion continued on two fronts at once. While Los Pepes emptied out his inner circle, the search bloc carried out thousands of raids and hunted his men one by one. By March 1993, the authorities had taken out around 100 gunmen and a dozen of the cartel's military chiefs, many of them among his most trusted. Close to 1,900 people were captured on suspicion of belonging to the organization, and several senior commanders of its armed wings surrendered. In barely 8 months, the structure that had defied an entire country lost roughly 80% of its firepower. The most intimate blow came in October 1993 when his last head of security, a man known as El Angelito, was eliminated. Without him, Escobar was left commanding low-level gunmen, inexperienced young men he could no longer fully trust. The man who had once commanded thousands was now moving with a handful of kids. He suffered from gastritis, slept little, changed hiding places constantly, and even talked about founding a supposed armed movement called Independent Antioquia, and about approaching the guerrillas simply as an accountant for their finances. None of those ideas went beyond desperation. The machine that had made him invincible was crumbling like a sandcastle. The manhunt mounted against him had no precedent on the continent. The search bloc, commanded by Colonel Hugo Martínez, carried out more than 10,000 raids over the course of the pursuit and took out close to 20 leaders of his organization. Every house searched, every hiding place uncovered, every front man captured took a little more air away from Escobar. The kingpin, who had once moved with convoys and private armies, was now sleeping in small rooms, changing shelters almost every night and avoiding leaving any trace. The money that had once flowed without limit began to run short as Los Pepes dismantled his finances, and with less money came fewer men willing to risk their lives for him. Paranoia became his permanent state. He knew that any of the people around him could be talking to the enemy because many of them already were. Every call, every message, every movement had to be timed to the second. For 14 months, a unit trained and funded by the United States tried to trace his communications without ever pinning him down long enough, because he never spoke for more than 2 minutes and moved constantly to confuse the signals. The net was tightening, but the kingpin kept slipping through. Only one thing was missing, that he lower his guard a single time. And the reason for lowering it would not be money or power, but the one thing he still had left intact. That is how he reached the point where only one priority remained: protecting his family. And there, without realizing it, he exposed the flank through which they would finally reach him. Cornered, Escobar tried to get his wife, Victoria Eugenia Henao, and his 2 children, Juan Pablo, 18, and Manuela, 9, out of the country. He tried twice to send them to the United States without success. Then he tried Europe. In late November 1993, the family flew toward Germany with a connection in Frankfurt, but the German authorities had already been alerted by the Colombian police and by the DEA, which even placed agents on board the plane. The Escobars were held for hours inside the aircraft and were sent back to Colombia on November 27th. A relative who had flown separately was also denied entry into British territory at Heathrow. No country was willing to take them in. That rejection, which looked like nothing more than a diplomatic defeat, was in fact the opening move in a far colder play. With the family back on Colombian soil and nowhere left to run, the state finally had what it needed to close the game. When they landed at El Dorado Airport, the kingpin's wife and children were placed under the custody of the authorities and housed in an apartment in the Residencias Tequendama in central Bogotá. The official version was that they were being protected from Los Pepes, who wanted to get to them in order to wound Escobar. The reality was something else. The building belonged to the Military Forces Retirement Fund, and on its lower floors a search block post was operating. The head of police intelligence, then Colonel Oscar Naranjo, ordered the hotel switchboard and apartment lines to be intercepted and microphones placed at strategic points. Every word the family said on the phone would be heard in real time. Escobar himself knew those phones were tapped, precisely because the building belonged to the military forces. He knew that talking to his family was dangerous, but he also knew that his wife and children were trapped, with no way out and under threat. The refuge that was supposedly keeping his family safe was, in reality, the bait. The protection was the trap. All that was left was for Pablo, a man who for years had been a master at not letting himself be traced, to make the one mistake he had almost never allowed himself. Meanwhile, in that apartment in central Bogotá, his wife and children were living their own confinement. Surrounded by agents, unable to go outside, afraid that Los Pepes would carry out their threats against them, they had become, without fully realizing it, pieces on a board being played from a distance. Every call from their father was at once a relief and a sentence. They begged him not to call, to take care of himself, to stop exposing himself. He could not help it. In those final months, Escobar had lost almost everything that had defined his life. The empire, the men, the money, the impunity, even his health. The only thing he had left was his family, and that family was trapped on the other end of a tapped line. The most elementary logic said that a fugitive as skilled as he was should never call a phone he knew was being watched. Under normal circumstances, he would not have done it. But for Pablo Escobar, in that December, rational thinking had stopped carrying any weight. The same obsession with protecting his family that had driven him to send them to Europe was now pushing him to dial, over and over again, the exact number his enemies were waiting for him to call. The instinct of a father overpowered the instinct of a fugitive. And that was perhaps the coldest part of the entire operation. They did not hunt him down for his crimes, they hunted him down through his love for his family. That mistake had a name and a date. On November 30th, Juan Pablo told his father over the phone that a journalist from Semana magazine, Jorge Lesmes, had sent him a list of questions for an interview. According to the son's own account years later, by then living in Argentina under the identity of Sebastián Marroquín, Escobar transformed in that instant. He stopped caring that he was being listened to, that the line could be intercepted, that every second on the phone brought him closer to death. He wanted to use the interview to shout to the world that his teenage children were going to be taken out for their father's sins. He dictated the answers over the phone again and again, correcting them, adding and removing lines, obsessed with getting them published exactly as he wanted. Every call lasted longer than was wise. The same caution that had kept him alive for 17 months gave way to the vanity of having the last word. And that was the first link in the chain that led him to the roof. On December 1st, he turned 44. He celebrated in the house where he was hiding, joined by his cousin Luzmila, his mother, and his last bodyguard, Álvaro de Jesús Agudelo, known as Limón, a man who had been his brother's driver and who became the only one who stayed by his side until the end. It was the last birthday of his life. By then, the apparatus waiting for him was fully assembled. An American electronic surveillance system mounted on aircraft flying over Medellin was capable of picking up and locating the origin of a transmission such as that of a cordless phone. On the ground, search block teams cross-referenced those same signals from several fixed points. The method was simple in theory and fiendish in practice, if several receivers picked up the same transmission. The intersection of their readings pointed to a spot on the map. The problem had always been time. A 2-minute call was not enough to pinpoint one house among thousands. That is why, for more than a year, the system had failed again and again against a man who hung up before the signals could finish converging. In the end, everything depended on Escobar talking too long just once, on his staying on the line a few seconds more than he should. The rest of the machinery was already switched on, waiting in silence. And on that December 2nd, the kingpin finally gave them the seconds they needed. On Thursday, December 2nd, 1993, Pablo Escobar woke up a little before midday, as he usually did. He ate a plate of spaghetti and lay his heavy body back down on the bed, this time with the cordless phone in his hand. The house was at Carrera 79B, number 45D94 in the Los Olivos neighborhood, a middle-class residential area of Medellin with quiet streets and 2-story houses with tiled roofs lined up in a row, very close to a sports complex. In the days before, he had been extremely careful. He moved around by taxi accompanied by Limón, made calls of less than 2 minutes and hung up before he could be located. His men even placed fake calls to media outlets, one of them posing as the kingpin on a Medellin radio station, in order to plant false leads and confuse the search block. But the intelligence team already knew those tricks by heart and did not even bother tracing the decoys. That day, however, Escobar stayed inside the house and started dialing for real. His first calls to the Residencias Tecundama, starting at 1:37 in the afternoon, were brief. On at least 2 occasions he failed, because that morning the family had instructed the switchboard operator not to put through calls from journalists, and he kept insisting while posing as one. On the 3rd attempt, he got through, and he finally made the mistake they had been waiting 14 months for. Escobar spoke to his wife and his son for 2 minutes and 25 seconds, far longer than he had ever allowed himself in months on the run. What kept him on the line was a piece of news. Juan Pablo told him that the Salvadoran president, Alfredo Cristiani, who was visiting Colombia, had made statements that seemed to leave the door slightly open for the family to travel to El Salvador. For the first time in weeks, something resembling hope appeared, a possible way out for his family. And that hope is what killed him. While Escobar clung to that idea and stretched out the conversation, the fixed tracking posts of the American Centra spike system and of the search block had already picked up the signal. triangulated the readings from several receivers and calculated its origin: the Los Olivos neighborhood. An agent who had spent years studying every one of his movements drove down the street in a vehicle, watching house by house, going up and down the block until he saw him. In a second-floor window, there was a heavy-set man with long, wavy black hair and a thick beard talking on the phone. The police knew Escobar had grown a beard. It was him. It is worth pausing here because the call explains how they confirmed the hiding place, but not how they got to that street. For months, the government had been opening its radios to the cartel's frequencies, and several of Escobar's former men were already operating on the other side, handing over information using a secret code that identified them in the communications. The manhunt was not won by a sniper. It was won by a network of betrayals that gradually stripped the kingpin of everything that had made him untouchable. A police colonel, Danilo Gonzalez, channeled information obtained through Los Pepes that tightened the net week after week. And there is a less widely told version, supported among others by the man who would later prepare his body, that on that same morning of December 2nd, the authorities had captured Gustavo Gaviria Jr., the kingpin's nephew and the son of his closest partner, and that after a violent interrogation he revealed his uncle's whereabouts. None of these versions rule each other out. They all converge on the same point. By the time Escobar picked up the phone that afternoon, his enemies were already far too close. The call did not uncover him from scratch. It only confirmed what Betrayal had been pointing to for months. At 2:35 in the afternoon, minutes after tracing the signal, the search block sent 3 vans carrying 17 of its best men toward Los Olivos. They reached the scene at around 2:50. The official version states that 14 agents from the elite force took part directly in the assault. Most of them surrounded the block, taking up positions along the street and the back alley, while 2 went in through the front door to head up to the top floor. That door was heavy, made of iron, and it withstood several blows before giving way. Inside the house, Escobar heard the noise, but for a moment mistook it for sounds from a construction site nearby and kept talking to his son. He asked Limon to go take a look. When the agents burst in, the ground floor was empty. The kingpin left the phone off the hook on the bed and the window open and headed for the only way out he had left. The roof his bodyguard had already jumped onto. The 2 men were now running across the tiles in broad daylight with dozens of rifles aimed at them from below. A sniper had even climbed onto the roof of the house next door. There was no way out. Limon went first. He jumped from the back window, landed on the tiles, and started running. The men posted in the alley opened fire and brought him down before he could get more than a few meters. Escobar tried the same route. He was carrying a 9mm pistol in one hand and a small caliber nickel-plated revolver, and he barely managed to fire a few shots toward the windows where the agents were appearing. The response was deafening. For several minutes, everyone fired at once, emptying their magazines at the roof. Before reaching the top, he fell face down, dislodging several tiles. He was hit 3 times, once in the leg, once in the torso, and a 3rd time in the head, entering behind one ear. That last one was fatal. When the search block men finally realized no one was returning fire and the shooting stopped, they climbed onto the roof. One agent shouted that it was Pablo. Major Hugo Aguilar lifted the body by the shoulder and turned it over. The broad bearded face, swollen, the bare feet, the blue shirt, the jeans. He picked up the radio and with an excitement that could be heard all the way down the street shouted, "Long live Colombia, we have taken out Pablo Escobar." The longest manhunt in the country's history had ended on a set of clay tiles, in less time than the last phone call had taken. There remained, however, the question that was never fully settled. Who actually fired the shot that finished him? The police always maintained that it was Major Hugo Aguilar, the same man who posed beside the body and was treated for a time as a national hero. Years later, that hero became a villain. He rose to become governor of Santander and ended up removed from office and convicted by the courts for his ties to paramilitary groups, adding a money laundering conviction on top. Diego Murillo Bejarano, alias Don Berna, one of the masterminds behind Los Pepes, claimed in his own book that it was his brother, nicknamed Semilla, who fired the final shot, a version the Truth Commission backed up, citing senior sources within the police itself. Others attributed the shot to a Los Pepes shooter, to an undercover American agent, to Delta Force. And then there is the family's version, the most uncomfortable of them all. His son insisted for years that his father was not shot down by the police, but that he took his own life with a shot to the head, keeping the promise he had made so many times that they would never take him alive. There is more than one way to end your own life, the son would say much later, suggesting that his father did everything necessary to avoid being captured alive. Every side claimed the last bullet for itself, but the shot, whoever fired it and whoever takes credit for it, was only the final formality of something that had already been decided. There is something worth keeping in mind throughout this entire story. In order to defeat Pablo Escobar, the state and its allies ended up looking dangerously like Pablo Escobar. Los Pepes used his own methods: intimidation, attacks on relatives, targeted violence, bodies left behind with messages on them. Many of those who collaborated in the manhunt were themselves criminals of the worst kind, leaders of rival organizations who would later inherit much of the business the kingpin left vacant. The Cali Cartel, which financed the pursuit from the shadows, would soon become the country's new power in the trafficking of substances. Don Berna, one of the men who claimed credit for his fall, would end up running the criminal structure that dominated Medellin for years. And in time, the Cali bosses and Don Berna himself would end up extradited to the United States, the very fate Escobar had feared his whole life and over which he had unleashed a war. The fight against the most wanted man in the world was not waged by heroes alone. It was also waged by an alliance of enemies who made use of the state and whom the state made use of in order to eliminate a common rival. That is why the question of who betrayed him has no single answer. Too many people betrayed him, and almost all of them at once, because the man on the roof had already been defeated long before he climbed onto it. In the end, the man who had survived all of his external enemies fell because of the ones he had inside. His partners of yesterday turned into Los Pepes, the Cali Cartel financing the manhunt from the shadows, his own gunmen handing over frequencies and addresses in exchange for staying alive, and his family, held as bait in a hotel that was wired from top to bottom. The state did not have to find him blindly across an entire country. He was brought closer to them step by step by the people who knew him best, until he was left so alone that a plate of spaghetti, one call too many, and the vanity of an interview were enough to end the story. The empire he had built on purchased loyalty came apart at exactly the point where it had been purchased. He was never beaten by a stronger enemy. He was beaten by his own. Amid so much betrayal, there was one loyalty that survived until the very last second. Álvaro de Jesús Agudelo, Limón, was not one of the cartel's great lieutenants or a military chief. He had started out as a trusted man for the kingpin's brother and ended up as his driver, his companion, and in the end, the only bodyguard he had left. While the partners crossed over to Los Pepes, while the gunmen handed over addresses and the former allies financed his downfall, Limón stayed. He was the one who was with him on his last birthday, the one who traveled with him in the taxis, the one who went out the window first that afternoon to try to cover his boss's escape. He fell on the tiles before Escobar did, brought down halfway across the roof. Popular tradition holds that the kingpin's last words were a shout of that man's name, a shout that years later became a song. True or not, the symbol remained. Out of the entire empire Escobar built by buying loyalty, the only loyalty that was never bought or sold belonged to a driver who died at his side. Everyone else, sooner or later, ended up on the other side of the net. An employee of a Medellin funeral home, Omar Albero Carmona, was chosen by the kingpin's own mother to prepare the body. He spent 24 hours alone with the body of the most wanted man in the world, covering the 2 head wounds with cotton and trying to restore a presentable face with makeup. According to his account, as he worked, he thought about the fact that he was touching the face of the most dangerous man on the planet, and even in death, that body was still a threat. There were warnings that a bomb would be planted at the funeral home and rumors that someone would try to steal the body. The next day, December 3rd, he personally drove the hearse to the Jardins Montesacro cemetery. Around 20,000 people crowded in to say goodbye, many of them poor families to whom Escobar had given homes and sports facilities, and who saw in him something different from the criminal the authorities feared. In the middle of the crowd, some followers tried to steal the coffin in order to carry it through the streets of the neighborhood where he grew up. They took the wrong one. They pulled out Limon's casket, the loyal bodyguard who died trying to cover his escape, and whose coffin was identical to his boss's. Even at his burial, Escobar's shadow ended up confused with that of one of the few people who never betrayed him. From those hours, one image traveled around the world. On the roof, agents from the search block and from the American agencies posed around the body, smiling, holding it up by the clothing like someone displaying a hunting trophy. It was the perfect photograph of an inversion. The man before whom an entire country had trembled for a decade now lay motionless, put on display, turned into a cause for celebration by the people who had hunted him. The official report described his body with the coldness of paperwork. Lying on his side, one arm over his head, legs crossed among the tiles dislodged by his fall. Nothing in that description recalled the kingpin who had put a price on the lives of ministers and judges. It was just a heavy-set, bearded, barefoot man lying on the roof of a neighborhood house. The same man who years earlier had weighed his money because there was too much of it to count, ended up being made up by a funeral home employee trying to conceal the wounds so that his mother could recognize him. The man who for years changed houses every night so that no one could find him was found because for once he needed to be heard. The man who built an empire on fear died barefoot on a rooftop with 2 barely used pistols and the telephone still off the hook in the next room. And the ones who did not go to cry at his funeral were not the people who feared him, but the people who had handed him over